All right, in 3.2 here, we are going to talk about carbohydrates, and we are going to primarily talk about carbohydrates in terms of the three different classes of them, categories of them. But to start with, carbohydrates have a general chemical formula that they follow. So that is C in proportion to 2 hydrogens, so 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, and then you add any multiple of N to that, so it could be 1 or 2, that would be C2H4O2, right, or 3C3H6O3, so on and so forth. That is the formula for a carbohydrate. So they are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so what do they do? We'll talk a little bit about the role of carbohydrates in cells of animals and plants and a few other things. We'll then talk about these different classifications here. And we'll talk about a few examples of common monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So you probably think of carbohydrates in terms of food. I know I certainly love my carbs, right? Bread, pasta, things like this, rice, packed full of carbohydrates, lots of great energy in there. Also, the simpler carbohydrates, glucose, things like that, give you that quick hit of energy. But we also need to think of carbohydrates in the context of structure. Here's a pile of wood, right? The majority of wood here is made out of carbohydrates. There's basically dead plant cells in there with lots of carbohydrate in there. And carbohydrates store lots of energy. So wood burns really, really well because those carbohydrates, they have lots of bonds in them. And when you break it, it releases energy. Okay, so let's start with the classes here, the three categories, and we will build upwards. So let's start at the bottom with what we call the monosaccharides. All right, here's where breaking down your words really, really helps. Mono is a prefix for one or single. And saccharide is another term for sugar, basically. So this is a single sugar. So it's a single monomer of sugar. There are several different types of monosaccharides. There's a lot, but they usually are grouped by how many carbon atoms they have in them. This might not seem important. This might even seem boring, but when we talk about how we go about breaking down our food energy, we're going to talk a lot about these carbons and the bonds between them. So this will come back to us in the metabolism chapter. It's not key that you memorize this or anything like that. Just know that there are different monomers here. So we have things like aldoses and ketoses. These are 3 carbon sugars, 1, 2, 3 right there. You can see they have a slightly different structure here. Those are more generally called trioses because they have 3 carbons in there. You can have pentoses, 5 carbons in there, or hexoses. These are very common. They have 6 carbons in there. A common hexose that you use is glucose. This is the most common fuel source for your body. And the formula, of course, is C6H12O6, following our general pattern. Let's do a little review problem that's going to test some of our knowledge from the previous chapter here. These molecules all have the formula C6H12O6, but they have different structures, so they're known as what? Go ahead and pause the video and think about that. All right, the answer here would be isomers. These are isomers of one another because they all have the same formula, but they have different structures. So here's a couple of isomers that you may have heard of before. We have glucose, we have galactose. You may or may not heard of that. We'll talk about where that is in just a moment in the disaccharides. Then we have fructose, which you've probably heard of as well in something like high fructose corn syrup. Technically, they have the same chemical formula, but different structures. So they do get metabolized slightly different. That makes them isomers. You'll notice that all of these end in the term ose. That's a pretty good indication that it is a monosaccharide, as if it ends in ose. Glucose is a really important one. We're going to keep coming back to that monosaccharide over and over again in this course. Glucose can most easily be broken down into what we call adenosine triphosphate. Of these three things, glucose is the easiest one to convert into ATP. ATP is like the cellular energy that your cells use to build new bonds and make new things. So glucose is the easiest one of these three to break down into ATP. Now, critically, plants can undergo this sweet chemical reaction called photosynthesis, where they take light, carbon dioxide, and water, and they stick carbon dioxide molecules together to build glucose. That's really important because you can't do that. You cannot just lay out in the sun and drink water and breathe carbon dioxide and make glucose. You have to eat other things to get glucose. Oftentimes that's plants or something that ate a plant, right? But plants, they don't need you. They can just sit in the sun and make their own food through that photosynthetic reaction. They just take carbon and stick it together, carbon dioxide, and use some water, and they can build glucose from sunlight. That's pretty cool. These monosaccharides, you may have seen them drawn linear, like in some of the diagrams. When they're dissolved in water, they often form a ring-like structure. So you might see some of them drawn out in these ring-like structures. There are different forms of them. Alpha glucose versus beta glucose, not super important for this course. But we will talk about a special pentose later, actually two. This one is ribose. Where have you heard of that? RNA is ribonucleic acid, so it's got ribose in it. If we take one of the oxygens off here, we have deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. So the sugar is part of the nucleotides of DNA as well. Okay, so those are our monosaccharides. There's more types of monosaccharides, but those are some of the common ones that we will encounter. What happens when we take one monosaccharide and another monosaccharide unit and stick them together? Well, in that case, we get what's called a disaccharide, di being two. Okay, so we take a glucose and a fructose, and we go through that dehydration reaction. I've abbreviated reaction, RXN here, because I'm lazy. You might see people do that as well. That's a good little thing to know. So we do our dehydration reaction, and we stick our glucose and fructose together, and we get a sugar that you're probably very familiar with called sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide. It's made up of a glucose monomer and a fructose monomer. Sucrose is your table sugar. If you bake, you usually use sucrose sugar if you're putting it into your cookies or whatever, things like that. Your body, when you eat that sugar, will then have to break down this bond and release the glucose and the fructose to be metabolized into energy. We call this bond a glycosidic bond, glyco meaning sugar, right? So it's a glycosidic bond. Again, I'm not going to use that terminology too much, but you might see the term glyco in many different places, and it's good to know that that means sugar. So some other examples of disaccharides. We have sucrose here, that's glucose and fructose. You may have heard of the sugar lactose, which is found in milk. Lactose is a glucose molecule with a galactose molecule. And then we have maltose. Maltose is a disaccharide that's made up of two glucose monomers. So disaccharides are two of these monomers put together. If you can do two, you can probably do more, right? So if we start tacking on more and more of these monomers, we end up with what we call a polysaccharide, poly meaning many. And as I showed you in the last section, we can get very, very long chains of glucoses to form things like starch and stuff like that. What I want to show you here is that just like we've talked about previously, shape is everything in chemistry. So the shape that these monomers get stuck together in can determine their properties. We might have branched chains where things get branched off of, or they might be unbranched. They might be straight chains. These polysaccharides, there's a lot of different ones. You've probably heard of amylose. That's a bunch of glucoses stuck together in a linear chain. You might have heard of amylopectin. That's a branched configuration. Same units, just different shape here, and it has slightly different properties. So these two things are both made up of the same monomers, but slightly different shapes. We also have many polysaccharides that are involved in structures. So you're thinking food in these two, right? These are starches that are found commonly in bread and grains and things like that. But we also have things that can be structural. But also, I want to point out one more energy storage one that you may have heard of if you're into human nutrition, glycogen. Glycogen is a polysaccharide. And so plants store energy generally in starch, these long carbohydrates. Humans, kind of medium-term storage of energy is often done in glycogen. So we tend to have or want to have a bit of free glucose around so we can get instantaneous energy. But if we're going to exert ourselves for longer periods of time, more than a couple of minutes, we're going to start going into our glycogen stores. Glycogen is a polysaccharide. Again, it's just a bunch of these glucose molecules stuck together, but it's in a much more branched arrangement. Those are energy storage. I've talked about structure. What do I mean structure? Well, cellulose and chitin, these are polymers of glucose that are arranged in such a way that they can form very strong and rigid formations. So we find these in the cell walls and the shells of organisms, whereas things like starch, you might find those in storage organs like a tuber. Glycogen tends to be stored a little bit in the muscles, but also there's large stores of glycogen in the liver in humans at least. So why do I talk about all this? Why am I talking so much about bonds and shape and things like that? Well, these bonds, they're kind of important. So you're probably aware that if you eat something like a potato, which is rich in starch, you're probably going to get a lot of energy from that, right? Whereas something like carrots and celery are not going to provide you a lot of energy. Go try and eat a bunch of grass and see how well you can run a mile just on grass, right? Like potatoes, carbo loading, you're going to do starchy things rather than cellulose things. Why is that though? Because at their core, they're just a bunch of units of glucose, right? Let me show you the difference here. Here's starch on top. It goes with this bond, 1,4 going downwards, 1,4 going downwards, 1,4 going downwards. We call that alpha glucose monomers. Whereas starch alternates. It has these beta glucose monomers. So it goes upwards and then downwards and upwards and then downwards. That might seem really minor. You're like, what? It's just slightly different direction. It's still the same thing. Well, this is key chemistry, and this is what's making the difference here. So why do we get lots of energy here and not a lot of energy here? Go ahead and think about that for a moment. Think about what eats these different things and whether you could survive off them or not. Okay, so you might have thought, there's some animals that can eat grass, like, I don't know, cows and things like that. Why is that? Whereas I need to eat like the potato or something like that to get enough energy to keep surviving. I couldn't live off carrots entirely. Well, it has to do with enzymes. And enzymes, as I mentioned, are very, very particular. There's an enzyme called amylase that you make that can break down starch, and it'll break it down into smaller units. But amylase only works on starch. It will only work on this bond. Amylase will not work on this bond in cellulose. That's how specific enzymes are. So you eat a bunch of cellulose here, like in your celery, you can't digest it. That's why we call it dietary fiber, because it ends up coming out the other end, right? Amylase will not digest it. But you probably said, well, the cow can survive off grass. Why can the cow do it? Is it because the cow has another enzyme to digest cellulose? Well, it's not actually the cow itself. It has to do with the cow's microbiome. This is probably a term that you've heard of at some point. But in the cow's stomach, there's lots of different types of bacteria. Some of those bacteria make an enzyme called cellulase. Cellulase can break down cellulose. So the cow itself can't break up that cellulose, but the bacteria in its gut, in its rumen, can break it down, right? So cows sit there and they chew on it and they chew on it and they digest it, and then they pass it back up and chew on it some more, and they send it down into their rumen where all these bacteria go to work breaking down the cellulose in there. If you had a cow that was born without these bacteria in its microbiome, and people have done experiments with this, it would not be very healthy. It would probably die because it could not get energy from that grass or cellulose that it's eating. So this is a very important relationship, the microbiome with the organism, right? The cow gives the bacteria a nice safe place to live and eats grass. The bacteria take some of that energy, but they also give some of that energy to the cow to allow it to live. So this is a symbiosis there. The field of our microbiomes is still evolving. There's a lot of research that is in its very infancy right now. You may have heard of studies that seem to link mental health with your microbiome and things like this. We don't understand those relationships. We're generally doing correlations right now. There are some good experiments where we have people who take like very powerful antibiotics when they have an infection, and that destroys their microbiome. To repopulate your microbiome, how do you think we go about doing that? Okay, this is where things get interesting. There is a treatment called the fecal transplant, where basically you put poo and the bacteria in poo back into the person to repopulate their gut microbiome. There is an FDA-approved pill for that now. There's really actually two ways you can go. You can go one way or you can go the other way to plant those bacteria back in. But that is a real treatment after people take like real strong antibiotics if they need it, if their microbiome has been destroyed. So it's a new field. We're still learning all about it. If you want to learn more about the microbiome and things like that, my Micro 250 class is a great place. We talk all about that in that course. All right, so that's our crash course in carbohydrates. We're going to talk mainly about glucose in this course, but that's because we're going to talk all about metabolism. So carbohydrates are sugars with the general formula Ch3.2 to the N, whatever, however many things, usually 6 if it's a hexose. They often function as energy storage, but they can also be structural components to the cell, like the cell wall in plants and in fungi. Fungi have a chitinous cell wall. You, as an animal, do not have a cell wall, so you don't use the carbohydrates structurally there, but you do store some. If we have a single monomer there, we call that a monosaccharide. If we put two of them together, we call it a disaccharide. And if we have many of them, 3 or more, we call that a polysaccharide. Those are linked together by a glycosidic bond. Okay, in the next section, we'll cover another important energy storage molecule, lipids.